Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco. Sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
Distracted by the finer things in life. You look shattered and he's broke, and all you have to do is find that guy who's perfect for you, and the fine line between wrong and right.
When you're part of a close-knit community that shares the same values and way of life, where everybody knows everybody, you'd think you would be safe and secure. But you never know what can happen behind closed doors.
When I heard about this young woman who'd gone missing, I was struck by how unusual an event this was. Police launched a proof of life investigation.
The name Proof of Life sounds encouraging. We were basically trying to establish if a person is dead.
The Scottish coast, with picturesque towns and quiet, calm locations. The last place you'd expect to uncover a story of abuse, neglect, and murder.
Inverkip, what a lovely location to live in. Sitting on the banks of the Clyde, overlooking the Argyll Hills and the forest on the other side of the river. And it always struck me as somewhere that would have been a lovely place to have grown up.
You would be very pleased if you got a house here with this sea view. So you don't believe that people go missing and never be found again. It's not a place that you would think anything like this would happen.
In the early 1990s, this idyllic area was home to the Fleming family and their daughter Margaret.
Margaret Fleming was the only child of Margaret and Derek Fleming. I think she was a very, very quiet child. She needed a lot of support in school.
Margaret had learning difficulties growing up, which wasn't diagnosed until later. At primary school, it was identified that she had problems with reading and writing, which later were revealed as learning difficulties. And this would have had an impact on friendships and how she related to other people and how other people related to her.
The family lived in the town of Port Glasgow, 10 miles along the coast from Inverkip. In January 1993, Margaret's parents divorced. Margaret was a vulnerable young woman, and now her world had been turned entirely upside down.
When Margaret was about 12 or so, she didn't get on with her mother particularly, so she moved in with her father and his parents.
She was very closely bonded to her father. She had quite a fractious relationship with her mum, but her and her dad were a little unit.
Margaret's father, Derek, was a tradesman who had retrained as a lawyer. He then met Jean.
I think we were about 3 years together. I didn't like him at first, because he was a lawyer. And then he says, "Oh, come on, I'll take you for a coffee." I went, "Aye, all right then." And we got on all right.
As she got to know Derek better, Jean saw his relationship with daughter Margaret firsthand.
Always together. Really. And wherever Derek was, Margaret was there. And it was lovely to see. She's quite shy, reserved. She'd take a while to get to know you. But when she did, she did. She clung on to you. She was really a nice little kid.
Jean and Derek eventually got engaged and started to make plans together, always making sure to include daughter Margaret.
And her dad told her we were going to get married. How do you feel about that? Well, she was a wee bit unsure about it at first. And I turned and said, "I ain't going to take your mum's place." Nothing's going to change. And she was quite happy about it. Unfortunately, her dad had cancer.
All parents worry about what they would do if they were unable to look after their children, and Margaret's father was no different. He had to find the right people to step in if the worst happened.
When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, one of Derek's greatest worries was who would care for Margaret once he died. Fortunately, some of his stresses were alleviated when a couple came forward and voluntarily agreed to care for Miss Fleming.
The couple were Edward Cairney and Avril Jones. Derek had got to know them after doing some legal work for Cairney.
He said he'd known him for years, he trusted him and that, and I said, well, that's at the time I said to him, I don't like him. I said, I've got a gut feeling.
Edward Cairney was thought to have had his finger in many pies, business-wise, in that local area. He was a fully qualified deep-sea diver and practiced that career, which is well paid because of the enormous risks attached to it. So he's a man who had a physical presence, a physically strong man. Some people who had dealings with him would find him intimidating, and I mean that simply by his presence. As for Avril Jones, she was a secretary to a law firm in the area for many years and pursued a perfectly legitimate and ordinary life.
Margaret's father didn't feel that his parents could really cope with Margaret and felt that perhaps Edward and Avril could look after her better.
You know you're ill. You've made a connection with these two people who you've put your trust in, and to give your child over suggests that he really believed that they would take really good care of her and have her back.
Derek made the couple Margaret's legal guardians in his will. Sadly, his illness progressed very quickly.
We were going to get married. He fell ill, went to doctors, and within 8 weeks, he was dead. From the day he went into hospital, I never went home. I never left. I sat there beside him until he passed away.
After Derek's death, while his estate was sorted out, Margaret stayed with family in order to limit even more disruption to her life.
When her father died, she was absolutely distraught, really bereft. She had lost somebody who, well, perhaps the only person who really loved her.
She went with her grandparents at first. They were devastated when Derek died. It was the only child. It was sad. Margaret, she'd taken it really bad when her dad went away. Both Derek's parents then went into a care home because they were too old to look after themselves.
At this point, Avril Jones and Edward Cairney stepped forward to look after Margaret, now 16. Jean had no choice but to let Margaret go. But she was not convinced about the couple. There was an age difference of 18 years between Avril Jones and Edward Cairney.
A few times I had to go out there with Derek. I just didn't like the guy. Avril wasn't that bad, but she was controlled by him.
In 1997, 16-year-old Margaret went to live with Edward Cairney and Avril Jones at their home in Inverkip. It seemed Jean wasn't the only person unhappy with the arrangement.
At one point, Margaret's mother did turn up to the house and said that she wanted Margaret to come back home and live with her.
There had been a furious row, and Cairney had made some threats, and in fact, she accused him of relatively low-level violence towards her. He demanded of Margaret, who was in the house when this was going on, who do you want to live with, us or her? And Margaret elected to stay with them.
I got the sense that she was frightened of Edward and probably Avril, and maybe she felt she had no other option but to say, I want to stay here.
It's hard to imagine how Margaret felt, but as she became more reclusive, she also became more isolated from those around her.
Cairney was clearly an individual who was controlling and dominating, always wanted to be in control of himself, his emotions, and his surroundings. When he was unable to successfully do this, what he would tend to do is be confrontational and retaliate.
Margaret Fleming had been living with Avril Jones and Edward Cairney since 1997, and they had cut all ties with the teenager's family and friends.
We never had any contact with Margaret, and that was even including Margaret's mother. They said Margaret didn't want nothing at all to do with us. Don't phone the house again, don't get in contact in any way or form. And that's what I done. I used to wonder, would she come and get in contact? Because I still had the same house phone number. I never changed it. She never phoned.
There was an occasion at a family celebration when Avril's brother and family had come up to Inverkip, and he heard this horrible moaning sound from within the house as he was speaking to his sister outside in the garden, and looking up and seeing Margaret, who appeared to have two lengths of cardboard tubing or guttering, some kind of cylindrical covering on her arms, and clearly distressed.
Avril's brother was told the tubing was to protect Margaret from self-harming.
Then there was a Christmas dinner where the Joneses family got together, but Margaret wasn't at that dinner. There were photographs taken, but Margaret wasn't in them, which struck me as odd. Would they not be asking, where's Margaret?
Margaret appeared to have vanished from sight, and it seemed no one was looking for her. In fact, no one would even inquire about Margaret's whereabouts for almost 17 years.
I didn't leave her. I was told she didn't want anything to do with me. And I wondered what she was up to. Did she get married? Did she have a family? You know. I did think Margaret would have come to me if there was anything wasn't gone right. You know, that she would get in contact with me. She never said. I thought her life was good.
Nobody heard from Cairney and Jones till 2016, when the Department for Work and Pensions received a new application for welfare payments from Avril on behalf of Margaret.
Avril Jones had been in receipt of benefit as being a carer for Margaret. The benefit system changed, so she had to reapply for a new kind of benefit called personal independence payment.
She requested more financial support. In the application, she stated that Margaret needed more care and attention.
Margaret would now be 35, and it appeared that in the last 17 years, her condition had badly deteriorated.
There was a list of things which indicated that Margaret was literally incapable of looking after herself even for a moment, couldn't be left on her own, she couldn't be trusted. She wasn't allowed into the kitchen where the dogs were because she had been found eating out of the dog's bowl. This raised eyebrows, as you might expect.
A local social worker telephoned Avril Jones to find out more.
Avril indicated that there was no way Margaret would speak to anyone or attend any appointment to be assessed because she was so terrified of authority and wouldn't leave the house.
But the social worker refused to be fobbed off.
She went straight round to the house herself without any answer. And at that, the concerns were so great in the mind of the social worker that she made an urgent referral to the police.
Late afternoon that same day, the 28th of October 2016, two police officers pulled up in a marked car at Avril Jones and Edward Cairney's home.
For obvious reasons, it was important that Margaret be seen and her well-being determined. They were able to see two figures moving towards the door after they had knocked the door. They then retreated, and one person came to answer the door, this being Avril. The officers were given access to the house. They found the most bizarre setup in the house with junk everywhere.
They were actually struck by the state the property was in. It was a very dilapidated house, very, very run down.
They went into the living room with Avril, who had immediately explained that she was the only person in the house and that Edward was out walking with Margaret. Now, the weather conditions were such that that was immediately unlikely. The female officer glanced out of the living room along a corridor which leads to the kitchen and saw, as it turns out, Edward Cairney kind of pressed in against the wall, she thought, as if trying to conceal himself, but able to hear what was going on in the living room. He'd clearly been there the whole time. And so one of the officers then said to Avril Jones, well, is that him there? And she feigned surprise that he was in the house. They asked the question, well, where's Margaret? She's in the kitchen, he said, making a show of opening the door, and then, as if startled and surprised, she's run away, she's gone.
When I heard about this young woman who'd gone missing, it did really intrigue me, because I knew the area where nothing much really happened, nothing much that was bad anyway. It was quite a community-orientated place. People seemed to look out for each other, and I was struck by how unusual an event this was.
The police had launched a missing persons investigation to look for Margaret Fleming, but soon discovered it wasn't going to be a straightforward case.
I would find it very hard to run away anywhere around here, because you've got this main road which is really dangerous and very busy, and then you've got the sea on the other side.
Because of the concerns for this vulnerable person, very quickly additional officers started arriving. And after a short time, CID officers were asked to attend as well. And so they asked Avril and Eddie repeatedly for detail as to where she had been, why she had fled, what had been happening. And it obviously struck Cairney quite quickly that the police weren't accepting this story. And he called out, you know where this is heading, Avril, this will end up as a murder charge. Which seemed a distinctly odd thing to say if all that had happened was that the girl or woman in their care had run away minutes earlier.
Police immediately started tracing anybody previously involved in Margaret's life who might know anything about her whereabouts. Jean hadn't seen her since the late 1990s.
CID come to my house and they asked me, did I know Margaret Fleming? I went, oh, don't tell me they've done her in. That was my exact words. Oh no, she's just missing. I actually nearly collapsed. And I couldn't get out of it. I couldn't sleep for weeks, because I never heard anything. But as soon as the CID came, Andrew, sorry.
Looking at the state of Jones and Cairney's home, detectives feared clues to Margaret's fate lay inside rather than outside.
The condition that that house was in was it was unlivable. It was a mess. It was contaminated with all sorts of stuff. What we'd be looking for here would be traces of Margaret in the house. Is there anything that indicates that she'd come to some sort of harm?
The detectives searched every inch of the house. They did not want to miss any evidence that would shed light on the miserable ordeal suffered by Margaret.
The police spent quite a time there trying to see any evidence at all that Margaret had been living there as they claimed. So, for example, are there any of her belongings here? Nothing. Toothbrush, even. No, she carries everything in a bag that she carries with her all the time, according to Avril.
They dug the garden, they searched the home. which I think was a very complex operation because the house was just full of rubbish. I think for the first time in Police Scotland's history, they set up a mobile laboratory in the couple's garden so they could test and analyse each item that came out of the house.
Everything that was handed over as being Margaret's was either Eddie's or Avril's, and when subjected to scientific examination, revealed no trace of Margaret's DNA.
Of all the thousands of objects that they tested, there was no sign of Margaret being there.
And that is something that is strange. And that is something that makes you think, has there been cover-up? Or has harm come to her some time ago? There was no forensic evidence to show that Margaret was in that house. But there was evidence from witnesses that speak to her being there, albeit some time ago. And that's important. So she was definitely in that house. She was there, it's just that she disappeared off the radar. And the only people that were there were these two carers.
In 2016, a search was on for a vulnerable woman, Margaret Fleming, who had gone missing. Her carers, Edward Cairney and Avril Jones, told police that she'd only recently run away. But a forensic examination of their house revealed no trace of her living there at all. Police feared a cover-up. Officers carried out an extensive physical search for Margaret and found nothing. But they weren't prepared to give up.
From quite an early stage, it was so obvious that the inability to find Margaret safe and well at that time was likely to be related to criminality rather than missing person. But there is a process through which the senior investigating officer must go before declaring a criminal inquiry.
When police interviewed Avril Jones's mother about Margaret's possible whereabouts, she immediately shot a big hole through the couple's version of events.
Avril's mother was astonished at the notion that the police would expect to find Margaret there because, as far as she was concerned, many years ago, Margaret had gone and had never been back.
There was a phone call between Avril Jones and her mother about the 5th of January 2000. Avril had told her mother that Margaret had gone off and had disappeared.
Avril had said to her mother that Margaret, who would have been 19 at the time, had left with a traveller.
The very idea that Avril's mother, who lives nearby, was telling the police, Margaret's not here and has not been here for years, whereas Eddie and Avril were saying she was here 10 minutes ago, didn't gel. It was pretty obvious, I think, that Margaret hadn't been there. There was a lie being told about her and that there had been a lot of money paid out of the taxpayer's pocket on the basis that Margaret was there and being cared for. So it was very obvious that at the very least a benefit fraud had been committed.
Looking for Margaret was like searching for a ghost.
You had no phone data, you had no forensic evidence, no one had been in contact with Margaret for all those years, and then these two, her carers, were leading police to believe that she disappeared. So really, all the lines of inquiry around Margaret had dried up. They had nothing to go on.
Police launched a proof of life investigation. They made a public appeal to see if anybody across the UK had heard of Margaret, or come across Margaret, knew of Margaret.
The name Proof of Life sounds encouraging. We were basically trying to establish if a person is dead.
They contacted all the GPs in the whole of the UK, all the health boards, all education authorities to see if there was any trace of her. They made inquiries with banks and credit companies, but there was absolutely no sign of her on social media either. No digital footprint, which is unusual, for the days that we live in.
The police knew it would be hard to prove Margaret had come to some harm without finding her body.
The area around the house where they were living, Cairney and Jones, huge amount of land, trying to search for that body. Diggers, they looked in the river, they had divers, everything they could do. They had a drone up trying to identify an area where she could be buried. I mean, that's a mammoth task. And really, Cairney and Jones gave them nothing to go on.
The house is very secluded, so anything that would have happened there, or, if you like your privacy, that's where you would have your house. Because the only people that can see you is from the sea. There might be a boat passing, but other than that, nobody would see you.
It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, trying to find Margaret Fleming. The only time you can prove she was alive was when she was last sighted on the 17th of December 1999, when Avril Jones' brother says he last saw her.
The investigation into Margaret's disappearance made it clear that no one had seen her since 1999, and the only two people that could account for her whereabouts were Cairney and Jones, and their stories weren't adding up.
I wouldn't even look at a newspaper. I wouldn't look at nothing because I couldn't. I'd just crumble all the time.
There'd been stuff in the press, and a lot of it was negative. We knew there was a bigger story here. We were just basically trying to find it.
In 2017, 1 year into the police missing persons investigation, one of photojournalist George Wright's colleagues in the media posted a card through Cairney and Jones' letterbox asking for an interview.
About a week later, after he put the card through the door, that he got a phone call. And they wanted to tell their side of things because they felt like everything was on them, everybody was against them.
On the 4th of October, George and his colleague went to interview Cairney and Jones.
Memories that we're bringing back is a wee bit of trepidation going up to the house, just wondering what it was going to be like in there. Because we've seen it from the road, it looked really run down and dark and dank. And it was, definitely. So this is bringing it all back again. We weren't sure exactly what we were going to get, if anything. They might have just said no at the time and we wouldn't have got anything, but we spoke to Edward on the doorstep and he eventually let us in.
He basically just asked him, well, where is Margaret? Tell us what happened. The story that they then came away with was so fantastical that at one point I was trying not to laugh because it was just unbelievable.
They actually said she was working as a gangmaster and she was running organised people trafficking and things like that.
And she was getting them to commit criminal acts for her, and she was the head of an organisation. But then 5 minutes before that, they had said that she was quite slow and she wasn't that bright.
Edward Cairney tended to want to take control. He wanted to do all the talking and not let, I think, Avril Jones speak at all.
They were actually asked on that interview, how did they feel that she's not appeared?
Normally, interviewees will say, well, please come home, give me a call. Even if we've had an argument, I want to hear from you. That's the sort of thing people tend to say in this situation.
They actually were quite vociferous. They didn't really like her. She was connected in drugs, she was involved in all sorts of things like that. So they were being quite nasty about Margaret.
I was raging. How dare you? Wrong. No. Margaret wasn't a gangster. She'd never get involved with anybody like that. He just wanted to cover his back.
This is what it is now. Just boarded up. I was actually glad to get out of the house and actually get some fresh air because all the windows were bolted shut. There was no air in the house at all. It was horrible. All you were breathing in was dust and dirt. And then Edward showed us painstakingly where the police had dug up quite a lot of the garden. I don't know why he was telling us that. I think he was wanting to feel sorry for him. You know, look what they've done to my garden. They've dug it all up. Well, there's been good reason why it was dug up.
And with the interview, Cairney and Jones were digging themselves deeper into trouble.
After that, things just snowballed very, very quickly. The investigation was ongoing by that point. Police kept it really quiet. I think the police were watching for any discrepancies in what they were telling us and them.
They gave different accounts at different times, but the recurring theme was that in the first week in January of 2000, she had gone away with someone from the travelling community and was living in Cumbria with travelling people. They then finessed the account to include that she would come back very frequently to collect the money that was hers. They obviously had worked out they still had to pretend that they were not the beneficiaries of this money, that in fact Margaret was still getting it. And this was part of the hole they were digging for themselves. Because it meant that since they were insisting on that, if we were able to prove that wasn't right, it greatly undermined any credibility their account might have.
Police believe that Margaret died sometime between the 17th of December 1999 and the 5th of January 2000. She would have just been 19 at the time.
In an attempt to counter this theory, Cairney and Jones produced letters they claimed were from Margaret to prove she had left their house alive and well. Apparently signed and dated between the 9th and 13th of January 2000, the first was posted in Carlisle and the other two were from the Regent Palace Hotel in London.
Margaret had difficulties with numeracy and literacy. One of her teachers had said that she had a reading age of about 8 and would really not have been able to write the letters that they said she had written.
Spelling and grammatical errors were deliberately generated to give the impression that they had been written by someone who was not very good at writing English. The letters were typed and sent, one from the English-Scottish border and 2 from London. The significance of the one from the border is that it would have been on the route that Cairney and Jones would have taken to travel down to London, that they were laying a false trail of letters sent by Margaret to explain that she wasn't coming back.
Ironically, Avril Jones's log of another form of correspondence would later back up the police's theory about the period in which Margaret died.
Avril Jones kept this Christmas card book, which is a sort of odd thing to do. I don't know anybody else. I've never come across anybody who keeps a Christmas card book. And she would tick off people who had sent her cards, but also who she had sent cards to. And there was a tick on Margaret's name for 1997, 1998, 1999. But after that, there was no tick for any year subsequently.
With the investigation cranking up the pressure on them, Cairney and Jones were about to crack.
They were ready to go. Cairney and Jones were about to board a train. They had a large sum of money. They were going. The heat was on them, and they were heading on a train down south when they were arrested by the police.
On October 26, 2017, Edward Cairney and Avril Jones were interviewed at Govan Police Station in Glasgow on the suspicion of murdering missing woman Margaret Fleming way back in 1999 when she was 19 and they were supposed to be caring for her.
They were interviewed simultaneously. Cairney's response at interviews was really quite farcical. He initially endeavoured to say no comment, but very quickly descended into personal abuse against the interviewing officer, clearly trying his best to unsettle him and avoid answering any relevant questions. He's a very, very arrogant man and insisted that Margaret was very much still alive and active.
Despite Cairney's bravado and Jones' silence, the evidence was mounting against the pair.
Avril, on the other hand, maintained no comment answers, but became upset a couple of times and insisted, for example, that Eddie knows where Margaret is. That was quite a telling point. But when tested or probed on the truth of what was happening with her benefit money, for example, and how often she would collect it, she was unable to be convincing at all about those sort of details.
The next day, Cairney and Jones were charged with Margaret's murder and were remanded in custody. As the news broke, the public was shocked as to how the couple had managed to hold their dark secret for 17 years.
People were really horrified about what had happened. There was probably a sense of guilt in the small village of Inverkip that Margaret had lived there, had disappeared, and nobody realised.
She never had a chance, did she? From the time the CID came to my door, I've never been right. I have a lot of regrets. Could I have done more to get Margaret? I really feel I let her down because I feel I never fought hard enough for it.
Margaret was really isolated from other people who loved and cared about her. And that feels incredibly tragic, that no one actually checked to see where she was and actually to see her face to face, but just believed the narrative that they were being given.
Margaret was simply a forgotten person. She was an individual that was vulnerable. We have this notion that because they're receiving guardianship and that they're receiving financial support from the state, that their well-being is catered for and looked after. Yet they're some of the most overlooked and neglected individuals.
Margaret had fallen through a crack in the system. Nobody, from the council or any other departments, social work and whatever, asked about her welfare or anything. Margaret being a missing person only came to light when the benefit system changed. But they've been claiming money for Margaret for years and years and years.
Something like £180,000, and the money had gone into Avril Jones's account as Margaret's carer. The couple did have some financial problems. They were found to have been in mortgage arrears. So there's a theory that they actually invited Margaret into the house deliberately in order to claim her benefits.
A person who's able to lie so elaborately about the killing of someone is clearly an individual who has depersonalized and dehumanized the victim. They consider the victim as an object. As such, they've been able to objectify their killing for just money.
Do you know, that's hard. That's very hard to accept another human being could do that to another kid. A kid. That's bad. That's evil. Really evil.
On April 25th, 2019, 77-year-old Edward Cairney and 59-year-old Avril Jones went on trial at the High Court in Glasgow, accused of murdering Margaret Fleming.
Without having a body, to get a conviction for a murder, although it's not unheard of, it is one of the most difficult cases. No DNA, no forensic, you have no idea how the victim met their death.
But there was still plenty of evidence in this case. There was no proof of life. Margaret was not living. There was a Christmas card book which was ticked off for the years. That stopped in 1999. There was inconsistency in statements. They produced false information that she was still alive. They were writing letters.
Focus then came to be on what was going on in London on 13th of January 2000, and that was the date on one of the letters. Cairney and Jones were real hoarders. They did not throw anything away. And that turns out, on the one hand, they say, well, we don't throw anything away, and that's why we've still got those letters from Margaret. I'm glad we didn't throw them away because we can prove she was alive and well. Nor did they, however, throw away the invoice from the Regent Palace Hotel showing that a couple in the name of Jones had stayed there on the 13th of January 2000.
This meant Cairney and Jones happened to be staying in the exact same hotel on the exact same night that Margaret had supposedly been there and written a letter to them to explain her disappearance.
Without that, I'm not convinced there would have been a case. To find that invoice, that was a real stroke of luck. It's an astonishing mistake to have made.
Edward Cairney did himself few favours either when Ian McSporran cross-examined him.
He started contradicting things he had previously said, quite significant contradictions. It was a bit like nailing jelly to a wall. If one story didn't turn out to be any good, he would change it to another story. And since the two of them had twined their fate, really, although Avril Jones didn't give evidence, the damage he was doing to her as well. She maintained a fixed gaze forward for almost all of the trial. There were no betrayal of emotions.
There were so many inconsistencies, and there was no doubt when this was all presented together that Margaret had been killed by these two.
The jury found Edward Cairney and Avril Jones guilty of Margaret Fleming's murder. Both were also convicted of perverting the course of justice, and Jones was additionally convicted of fraudulently claiming £182,000 in benefits.
The reality is, criminal geniuses are very few and far between. The jails are full of people who aren't as clever as they thought they were.
Jones and Cairney were each sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years.
They've never admitted to murdering the young women they were supposed to be looking after. And Margaret's body's never been found.
You'll find her in the bottom of the sea. I'm still convinced of it. Nothing will change me. She's at the bottom of the sea.
When killers don't confess to the crimes that they've committed, nor do they tell authorities where their victim's body is located, this for many is their last form of control. We know that Cairney is an individual who liked to be dominating, and as such, this is one of the last forms of control that he has over authorities, over the victim, and over the victim's family.
What happened to Margaret is an unfinished, incomplete story. And psychologically, that can be deeply, deeply painful. Where is she? What happened? How did she die? We can't even bury her. We can't even honour the life that she had. So all these questions remain questions for the rest of their lives until these two people decide whether they're going to speak out or not.
But sometimes allegiances change. You never know. As Cairney's older, if he died first, who knows, Avril Jones might be able to tell the police in Scotland where Margaret Fleming's body is to give them closure and do the decent things so they can bury Margaret.
Margaret's story is heartbreaking. She was a vulnerable woman who needed support, and the very people who were meant to be her protectors ended up betraying her in the most unimaginable way.
Margaret came from Port Glasgow. I want to get a bench to be put up in the shopping centre and get a plaque put on it for her so that she'll never, ever be forgotten. I wanted to bring her up as mine. She'd have had a good life. Oh, she would have had a good life.